Imagine you are standing in a dimly lit operations room somewhere in southern England. The year is 1940. Outside, the sky is being torn apart by the greatest air battle in human history. Young men, boys, really, are dying at 30,000 feet while the fate of Western civilization hangs by the thinnest possible thread. And inside this room, two British commanders are not just fighting the Germans. They are fighting each other. One of them will be vindicated by history. The other will be celebrated as a hero. And the terrible irony is, they might have it completely backwards. This is not just a story about airplanes and radar and fighter tactics. This is a story about ego, about institutional politics, about the difference between winning a battle and winning an argument. This is a story about how two brilliant men on the same side, with the same enemy, came to despise each other so completely that their feud would outlast the war itself, damage careers, destroy reputations, and leave historians arguing to this very day about who was right, who was wrong, and whether any of it even mattered in the end. Welcome. Sit down, because what you are about to hear is one of the most fascinating, most bitter, most consequential arguments in the entire history of aerial warfare. This is the story of the Big Wing controversy. This is the story of Hugh Dowding versus Trafford Leigh-Mallory. And by the time we are finished today, you are going to have an opinion. And it is going to be a strong one. Let us begin at the very beginning, because you cannot understand this argument without understanding the world that produced it. The year is 1936, and the Royal Air Force is quietly, systematically, building something that the world has never seen before. They are building an integrated air defense system. And the man at the center of that system is Air Chief Marshal Hugh Tremenhere Dowding. Even his name sounds like authority, like old stone walls and cold English mornings. Dowding was not a warm man. He was not the kind of general who slapped you on the back and bought you a drink. His subordinates called him stuffy, and not affectionately, not always. He was reserved, precise, deeply serious, and he had a vision. His vision was that the next great war would be decided in the air, that Britain's survival would depend on its ability to defend its airspace, and that the way to defend that airspace was not through brute force, but through intelligence, through information, through systems, through coordination. He championed the development of radar when almost no one else believed in it. He built the Dowding System, a revolutionary network of radar stations, observer posts, filter rooms, sector stations, and operations rooms that could track incoming enemy aircraft and vector defending fighters to intercept them. It was, for its time, the most sophisticated air defense network on the planet. And it was his baby. Every wire, every telephone line, every plotted position on every operations table, all of it flowed from his thinking, his insistence, his stubborn refusal to let the idea die when powerful men told him to abandon it. By the summer of 1940, Dowding commanded RAF Fighter Command. He had 11 groups. But the two that matter for our story today are two things. 11 Group, which covered London and the southeast of England, the front line, the place where most of the fighting would happen, and 12 Group, which covered the Midlands, the area just to the north. 11 Group was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, a New Zealander, cool, analytical, deeply loyal to Dowding and to Dowding's methods. 12 Group was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. And Leigh-Mallory had ideas. Very different ideas. Very loud ideas. Now let us talk about what the summer of 1940 actually looked like from the ground, from the cockpit, from the operations room. Because unless you feel the pressure of it, the grinding, relentless, exhausting pressure of it, the argument about tactics will feel abstract, academic, almost meaningless. It was not meaningless. Nothing about that summer was meaningless. Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe began its concentrated assault on Fighter Command in early August 1940, in a phase the Germans called Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack. The plan was straightforward in its brutality. Send wave after wave of bombers escorted by fighters. Destroy the RAF on the ground. destroy the sector stations that coordinated the defenses, destroy the radar towers on the coast, destroy the aircraft factories that built the Spitfires and Hurricanes, destroy Fighter Command's ability to resist. And then, the invasion fleet waiting in the Channel ports could sail, and Britain would fall, and the war in the West would be over. The weight of that plan fell almost entirely on Keith Park and 11 Group. Day after day, week after week, the calls came in. Raids forming over the Channel. Dozens of aircraft. Hundreds of aircraft. The young pilots. And so many of them were so young. 19, 20, 21. Scrambled to their Spitfires and Hurricanes. Took off into a sky that was already full of danger and flew directly into oncoming walls of German metal. They fought. They came home. Some of them. Then they ate, if they could eat, slept for a few hours, and did it again the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. Park's method was what you might call the forward interception strategy. When a raid was detected coming in, he would send up his squadrons in relatively small numbers, typically 1 or 2 squadrons at a time, and vector them to intercept the Germans as early as possible, ideally over the Channel or the coast, before the bombers reached their targets. The logic was compelling. Hit them before they reached the airfields. Break up the formations. Force the fighter escort to engage. Protect the radar stations and the sector stations that keep the whole system running. It worked. Not perfectly. Nothing in war works perfectly, but it worked. The Germans were suffering significant losses. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were operating at the extreme edge of their fuel range, which meant they could not loiter over England for long. Every minute they spent dogfighting was a minute less they had before they had to turn back for France or run out of fuel over the Channel. Park understood this. Dowding understood this. The system was working. But here is what it looked like from the outside, and specifically from 12 Group to the north. It looked like chaos. It looked like bleeding. It looked like crisis. Because the numbers of aircraft available to intercept were always small. Park was sending up 1 squadron, 2 squadrons, while the incoming raid might be 100 German aircraft. And yes, the system was working, but it did not look like it was working. It looked desperate. It looked like they were barely holding on. And to Trafford Leigh-Mallory, sitting in his headquarters in the Midlands, it looked like it was being done wrong. Leigh-Mallory was a very different kind of man from either Dowding or Park. He was ambitious in a way that was impossible to miss. He was politically astute, almost dangerously so. He had connections. He knew how to work a room, how to charm the right people, how to put his arguments in the most persuasive possible light. And he had become very close to a young squadron leader named Douglas Bader. Douglas Bader. Now there is a name. There are very few figures in the history of the Royal Air Force who have generated more genuine affection, more genuine admiration, and, when you look more carefully, more genuine controversy than Douglas Bader. He had lost both his legs in a pre-war flying accident. Lost them completely. And he had fought his way back into the cockpit through sheer, ferocious willpower, flying on artificial legs, becoming not just a serviceable pilot, but one of the most aggressive, most skilled fighter pilots in Fighter Command. He was inspiring. He was charismatic. He was brave in a way that made your chest ache just reading about it. He was also absolutely certain that he was right about tactics. And the tactic he was certain about was the big wing. The big wing, or the Balba, as it was sometimes called, after the Italian Air Marshal Italo Balba, who was famous for leading massive formations of aircraft, was built on a simple, powerful, emotionally satisfying idea. More is better. If 1 squadron of 12 aircraft can attack a German raid, then 5 squadrons of 60 aircraft can do it 5 times better. Instead of sending up small numbers of fighters that are often outnumbered and sometimes surprised, assemble a massive formation, a wing of 3, 4, 5 squadrons, and then send that formation as a single, overwhelming, crushing force against the German raiders. Hit them hard. Hit them in numbers. Make the Germans feel what it is like to be outnumbered for once. It sounds wonderful. It sounds like the kind of bold, decisive, aggressive stroke that wins wars. And Bader, flying out of Duxford in 12 Group, began doing exactly this without formal authorization in August and September of 1940. He assembled what became known as the Duxford Wing, eventually 5 squadrons flying together. And whenever 11 Group called for help from 12 Group, Bader would gather his wing and come south in force. And when the Duxford Wing arrived over the battle, it was impressive. It was visually and psychologically overwhelming. Pilots reported enormous satisfaction in being part of it. And Bader, with his extraordinary self-confidence, his infectious certainty, his genuine bravery, became the big wing's most passionate advocate. He took his arguments to Leigh-Mallory. Leigh-Mallory took them further. And suddenly the big wing controversy was not just a tactical disagreement between two groups. It was a political battle at the highest levels of the Royal Air Force. Now let us be very precise about what was actually being argued, because this is where so many popular accounts get muddy and imprecise. The argument was not simply, should we use big formations or small formations? The argument was much more specific than that, and the specifics matter enormously. The argument was about how to use 12 Group as a reinforcement for 11 Group when 11 Group called for help. Under the existing system, when 11 Group was overwhelmed and needed assistance, they would call on 12 Group. Park wanted 12 Group to provide relatively quick reinforcement, not necessarily massive in number, but fast enough to be useful, to help cover the sector stations and airfields while 11 Group's squadrons refueled and rearmed. Leigh-Mallory and Bader wanted to assemble a massive wing before coming south, which took time, significant time, sometimes 30 to 45 minutes or more, but would then arrive in overwhelming force. The time problem was not a small problem. It was not a rounding error. It was potentially fatal, because if it takes 45 minutes to assemble a big wing and the German raid takes 30 minutes to cross southern England, then the big wing arrives after the bombers have already hit the target and turned for home. And meanwhile, the sector stations have been bombed, the airfields have been cratered, and the squadrons that needed relief are still sitting on the ground waiting for someone to come. Keith Park was furious about this. He was furious about it professionally, and as the battle wore on, he became furious about it personally too. There were specific incidents, specific, documented incidents, where he had called for 12 Group reinforcement and the help arrived too late, or not at all, or arrived while the Germans were already heading home, and the undefended sector stations had taken punishing hits. In his reports, Park was direct and damning. The big wing was arriving too late to be useful. The delay in assembling was costing lives and costing critical infrastructure. Bader responded with his own numbers. And this is where the controversy gets truly rich and complicated, because Bader's numbers were spectacular. The Duxford Wing was reporting massive kill counts, dozens of German aircraft destroyed in single engagements. The overclaiming was extraordinary. In one famous engagement in September 1940, the Duxford Wing claimed kills that, when checked against German records after the war, turned out to be wildly exaggerated. The actual numbers of German losses were a fraction of what had been reported. This was not entirely dishonest. In the chaos of air combat, with multiple pilots firing at the same aircraft and smoke and explosions everywhere, honest overclaiming was endemic on all sides. But the big wing's claims were particularly extreme, and they were being used to make a political argument. The politics of this situation deserve their own careful examination, because they shaped the outcome in ways that had nothing to do with who was tactically correct. Leigh-Mallory had allies in high places. He had the ear of certain members of the Air Council. He had a particularly important relationship with Air Vice Marshal Douglas, who was the deputy chief of the Air Staff, and who had his own reservations about Dowding's methods and Dowding's somewhat difficult personality. And then there was Harold Balfour, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Air, who was politically connected and who found the big wing argument compelling and exciting. Meanwhile, Dowding and Park were not playing the political game. Dowding in particular was constitutionally unsuited to it. He believed, perhaps naively, that the facts of the matter spoke for themselves. He believed that the system he had built and the tactics his men were using had kept Fighter Command alive and fighting through the most intense aerial assault in history. He believed this would be recognized and rewarded. He was wrong about that last part. Very wrong. In September and October of 1940, while the battle was still being fought, while young men were still dying in the skies over England, Leigh-Mallory and Bader brought their case to a meeting at the Air Ministry. It was presented almost as an indictment of 11 Group's methods. Bader spoke passionately and with enormous conviction about the superiority of the big wing approach. Park was not invited to defend himself. Dowding was not invited to defend himself. The meeting happened around them, without them, and the conclusions drawn were not in their favor. The aftermath was swift and brutal. In November 1940, Hugh Dowding was removed from command of Fighter Command. He was given no clear reason, no celebration, no proper farewell. The man who had built the system that had saved Britain was essentially shown the door. He was 60 years old. He had given his professional life to the defense of his country, and they got rid of him with something between embarrassment and relief. Keith Park was removed from 11 Group shortly afterward. He was given a training command, a humiliation for a man of his ability and his record. And who replaced them? Sholto Douglas replaced Dowding, and Leigh-Mallory replaced Park. The men who had argued for the big wing were now in charge of implementing it, which would be a vindication of their position if the big wing had actually been correct. But here is where history becomes genuinely uncomfortable for those who orchestrated this outcome. By the time Douglas and Leigh-Mallory took over, the Battle of Britain was effectively over. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. Hitler had postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The RAF had survived, and the reasons it had survived, the Dowding System, the radar network, the forward interception tactics, the grinding attritional resistance, had nothing to do with the big wing. The big wing had been a sideshow, a colorful and loudly proclaimed sideshow, but a sideshow nonetheless. The historical verdict on this point is about as clear as history gets. The Battle of Britain was won by Dowding and Park's methods. The forward interception strategy, the careful management of a limited resource, Fighter Command could not afford to lose more planes and pilots than it could replace. The sophisticated use of radar and the operations room system, the deliberate policy of avoiding the kind of massive, decisive, all-or-nothing engagements that could have destroyed Fighter Command in a single catastrophic defeat. All of this was Dowding. All of this was Park. And yet the political outcome rewarded Leigh-Mallory. He rose higher and higher in the wartime RAF, eventually commanding all Allied air forces for the D-Day invasion of Normandy in 1944, one of the most powerful positions in the entire Allied military structure. He died in a plane crash in November 1944, before the war ended, before he could face whatever post-war reckoning might have awaited him. Dowding, after his dismissal, went on a mission to the United States to discuss air matters, a mission that was largely honorific and somewhat beside the point. He was eventually given a peerage. He became Lord Dowding, and he lived until 1970. But the honors came slowly and felt incomplete. He spent significant parts of his later years writing about spiritualism, about his belief that the spirits of dead pilots had contacted him, a belief that many of his contemporaries found embarrassing and which further complicated his legacy. Park went on to have a remarkable second act. He commanded the air defense of Malta during that island's extraordinary siege, and did so with exactly the same forward interception tactics that had been questioned and dismissed in England. He was brilliant in Malta. He later commanded Allied air forces in Southeast Asia. When the war ended, Keith Park had one of the most distinguished combat records of any air officer on the Allied side, and history has been much kinder to him than his wartime superiors were. Now let us step back from the narrative, from the careers and the personalities and the politics, and ask the question that really matters. Was the big wing actually a mistake? Was it wrong? Not politically, tactically, operationally, in the cold strategic light of what was actually needed to win the Battle of Britain. Was it wrong? The most honest answer, and the most interesting answer, is it was not necessarily wrong everywhere, but it was wrong for 11 Group in the summer of 1940. And that distinction is crucial. The big wing controversy has sometimes been framed as a debate between two universal principles, small formations versus large formations, as if one must always be superior to the other. That framing is too simple. The real question was always, given these specific circumstances, these specific constraints, these specific threats, which approach serves the objective best? 11 Group's objective was to defend London and the southeast while preserving Fighter Command's fighting strength. The enemy was attacking in large numbers and attacking quickly. The targets, sector stations, airfields, radar towers, needed protection immediately, not after a 45-minute assembly process. In this context, the forward interception strategy was correct. The big wing was too slow. It arrived too late. It sacrificed flexibility for mass, and in the circumstances of the Battle of Britain, flexibility was worth more than mass. But there are circumstances where the logic reverses. When you are on the offensive, when you have time to assemble, when your objective is to destroy enemy aircraft in large numbers in a single engagement rather than to protect specific ground targets from imminent attack, then larger formations have real advantages. They provide mutual support. They are harder to ambush. They can bring overwhelming firepower to bear. There are moments in aerial warfare where you want to be Bader, gathering your wing, sweeping in like a clenched fist. What Bader and Leigh-Mallory failed to understand, or perhaps refused to understand, was that those were not the circumstances of 11 Group in the summer of 1940. They were looking at the problem through the wrong lens. They saw the small numbers of aircraft going up, and they felt instinctive revulsion at the seeming weakness of it. They wanted to fight like fighter pilots are supposed to fight, aggressively, boldly, in overwhelming strength. And that instinct, while generally honorable, was tactically wrong for this particular battle at this particular moment. There is something almost tragic about Bader's role in all of this. He was not a scheming political operator. He was a man of genuine courage, genuine ability, and genuine conviction. He believed in the big wing because he had flown it, because it felt right, because in his experience it had seemed to work. He did not have access to the full picture, the German records, the actual kill counts versus the claimed kills, the detailed timeline of what happened when the wing arrived late at damaged airfields. He was arguing from experience and from intuition, and his experience and intuition were leading him astray. But Leigh-Mallory is a more complicated figure and a less sympathetic one. Because Leigh-Mallory did have access to broader information. He was a senior commander. He was receiving reports. He could see, if he chose to look carefully, that the big wing's kill claims did not hold up to scrutiny, that the timing problems were real, that Park's fury about late reinforcement was not manufactured outrage, but genuine operational complaint. Leigh-Mallory chose not to look too carefully, and one must ask why. The uncomfortable possibility, and historians have danced around this without always saying it plainly, is that the big wing controversy was partly a cover for something else. Leigh-Mallory wanted 11 Group. He wanted the command of the frontline group, the most prestigious, most active, most important command in Fighter Command. Park had it. Leigh-Mallory wanted it. And the big wing argument was a way, whether consciously or unconsciously, of making the case that Park was doing it wrong and Leigh-Mallory would do it better. If that is even partially true, and there is enough in the historical record to make it at least plausible, then the outcome was particularly grotesque. Because the tactical argument that was used to depose Park and Dowding was never really tested in the circumstances it claimed to address. Once Leigh-Mallory had 11 Group, the Battle of Britain was over. The massive German raids of the summer were replaced by the night blitz, and the big wing was completely useless against night bombing, because you cannot assemble large daylight fighter formations against bombers you cannot see. The tactical question of whether the big wing would have worked in place of Park's forward interception strategy was never answered, because the battle conditions that made the question relevant had already passed. What we are left with, then, is a controversy that is deeply, genuinely unresolved at its core, not because the historical evidence is unclear, but because the fundamental question contains within it several different questions that have different answers. Did the big wing work as Bader and Leigh-Mallory claimed? No. The kill claims were wildly exaggerated, and the timing problems were real and damaging. Was the forward interception strategy the right approach for 11 Group? Yes, almost certainly. Did the political campaign against Dowding and Park constitute a serious injustice? Yes, I believe it did. Did Leigh-Mallory act with anything resembling professional integrity in how he prosecuted that campaign? That is where reasonable historians genuinely disagree. And then there is the question that hangs over all of it. The question that makes the whole story feel so deeply painful when you sit with it long enough. Does any of it matter? The Battle of Britain was won. Britain survived. The invasion never came. Fighter Command was not destroyed. Winston Churchill's famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," were spoken about these pilots, these events, this struggle. And the struggle succeeded. So does it matter whether it succeeded because of Dowding and Park or despite the disruption caused by Leigh-Mallory? Yes, it matters. It matters for several reasons, and each of them is important. It matters because history that misattributes credit and blame will misunderstand the lessons. If the big wing is remembered as the solution rather than the problem, then the next generation of commanders will reach for the wrong tool when the next crisis comes. It matters because the men who did the right thing deserve to be recognized, and were not. Dowding died in 1970. Park died in 1975. For decades after the war, the official narrative was confused and incomplete, and both men felt the weight of an incomplete vindication. It matters because institutional processes that remove competent commanders for political reasons are dangerous, and the Battle of Britain is a case study in how that danger can emerge even within a successful organization in the middle of a fight for survival. And it matters because the human beings at the center of it, Dowding, Park, Bader, Leigh-Mallory, were not symbols or abstractions. They were men with careers and reputations and families and feelings, and what happened to them was consequential in ways that went far beyond the tactical argument that nominally triggered it. Let us spend a moment with Hugh Dowding in the weeks after his removal, because it is important to feel the human dimension of what happened. He had commanded Fighter Command since 1936. He had built it from a collection of biplanes and telephone lines into the most sophisticated air defense system in the world. He had fought for radar when radar was not fashionable. He had husbanded his pilots, carefully and sometimes controversially. There were those who felt he was too cautious, too reluctant to commit all his resources, because he understood that the only unrecoverable loss was the loss of the system itself. He had presided over the greatest defensive air battle in history. And then, in November 1940, he was handed a letter, given a brief handshake, and told that his services were no longer required. He walked out of Bentley Priory, the Fighter Command headquarters outside London, and he drove away, and that was the end. No ceremony, no formal recognition, no words from Churchill, who was effusive with praise for so many people, but somehow never quite found the right moment to publicly honor the man who had saved his country. Dowding's immediate reaction, by the accounts of those who knew him, was not bitter anger, but something closer to stunned incomprehension. He had done his job. He had won, and he was being dismissed as if he had failed. Keith Park's feelings about all of this were less opaque. He was angry. Professionally, righteously angry. He spent years after the war ensuring that his version of events was documented and understood. He gave interviews. He wrote letters. He fought back, quietly, persistently, with the same controlled determination he had shown in the operations room during the battle. And eventually history largely vindicated him. His reputation recovered completely. Today, in his native New Zealand, he is regarded as a national hero. In London, there is a statue of him by the south bank of the Thames, looking out over the city he helped defend. It is a good statue. He deserved it. Bader's post-war life was complicated in its own way. He was shot down and captured in 1941, one of the most remarkable episodes of his remarkable life, and he spent much of the rest of the war as a prisoner. After the war, he returned to civilian life, eventually working for Shell Oil, flying private aircraft, and becoming one of the most prominent advocates for disabled people in Britain. He was knighted. He was celebrated. His story was made into a film, Reach for the Sky, that made him one of the most famous British servicemen of the war. He died in 1982. He never publicly recanted his support for the Big Wing. He never said he had been wrong. Whether this reflects genuine conviction, he truly believed it to the end, or a less admirable stubbornness is something you will have to decide for yourself. What I will say is that the man's courage, his example, his refusal to be defined by his disability, these are real, and they are admirable, and they exist separately from the question of whether he was right about fighter tactics in the summer of 1940. The Battle of Britain itself deserves one more careful look before we reach our conclusion, because there is a detail about its outcome that is often overlooked in the Big Wing controversy, and that I think changes the shape of the argument significantly. The Luftwaffe came closest to defeating Fighter Command not in the dramatic large-scale engagements where the Big Wing would have been most visible and most dramatic, but in a quieter, more grinding phase in late August and early September when the German strategy shifted to attacking the sector stations, the nerve centers of the Dowding System. If those attacks had continued, if the Luftwaffe had maintained its focus on the sector stations rather than switching, fatally, to bombing London after the RAF bombed Berlin, Fighter Command might have been crippled regardless of tactics. The sector stations were being systematically destroyed. The operations rooms were being hit. The plotters and controllers and ground crews were being killed. Dowding himself later said that Fighter Command was close, very close, to being unable to function effectively. Not destroyed, not defeated, but degraded to the point where the air defense system might have failed. It was Hitler's decision to switch the Luftwaffe to bombing London, triggered by the RAF's retaliation bombing of Berlin and Hitler's furious, emotionally driven response, that saved Fighter Command. The sector stations got a breathing space. They were repaired. The system recovered. And Fighter Command survived. In this context, the Big Wing controversy looks different. Because if the decisive factor was Hitler's strategic blunder, then perhaps neither Dowding's forward interception strategy nor Leigh-Mallory's Big Wing was the true determinant of the outcome. Perhaps Fighter Command just had to survive long enough for Hitler to make his mistake. And in that race against time, in that grinding, attritional, day-by-day effort to not be destroyed, Dowding's careful husbanding of resources, his forward interception strategy, his refusal to commit everything to single decisive engagements, was exactly right. The Big Wing would have been expensive, probably prohibitively expensive, in that specific context. So we return to our verdict. The Big Wing was a mistake in the summer of 1940. Not a mistake in principle. In other circumstances, in other battles, massed fighter formations have their place. But a mistake in practice, in the specific circumstances of the Battle of Britain, in the specific role it was being proposed for, reinforcing 11 Group against time-critical attacks on vital ground infrastructure. The forward interception strategy was correct for the battle that was actually being fought, and the removal of Dowding and Park was, I believe, one of the most serious institutional failures of the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. Not because it affected the outcome, the battle was already won, but because it punished competence, rewarded political maneuvering, and sent a signal about what the RAF valued that was exactly the wrong signal to send. Fortunately, the RAF was an institution with enough inherent strength and talent that the consequences of this failure were limited, but they could have been devastating. In a worse scenario, a closer battle, a slightly different timing, the same political dynamics that removed Dowding could have cost Britain the war. History is made of those moments where the worst scenario almost happened, where the thread was thin and might have broken. The Battle of Britain is full of such moments, and the Big Wing controversy is one of them. Not because the Big Wing itself nearly cost Britain the battle, but because the toxic politics that surrounded it nearly destroyed the system that saved Britain before the battle was won. That is perhaps the deepest lesson of the whole episode. Not the tactical lesson about fighter formation size, though that is real and important, but the institutional lesson about how organizations behave under stress. Even in a life-or-death struggle, with everything on the line, the ancient human instincts of rivalry, ambition, territorial protection, and political maneuvering do not go quiet. They do not stand aside out of patriotic deference to the greater cause. They operate in the shadows of the operations room just as surely as they operate in boardrooms and parliaments and academic departments. And unless they are actively managed and resisted, they can do enormous damage. Dowding was not blameless in this, it should be said. His interpersonal difficulties, his coldness, his difficulty with subordinates who challenged him, his sometimes poor management of the relationship with the Air Ministry, all of these created the space in which his enemies could operate. A more politically astute commander might have neutralized Leigh-Mallory before the situation reached crisis point. A more personally warm commander might have built the kind of loyalty among his peers that would have protected him from political attack. Dowding was who he was. He was brilliant and limited and deeply human, like most of us. Park was more astute than Dowding, but even Park did not fully appreciate the severity of the political threat until it was too late. He was focused on the battle, on the raids coming in every day, on the exhausted pilots and the battered sector stations. He was doing his job, and that, in a way, was his undoing. There is a bitter irony in all of this that I want to name directly before we close. The Battle of Britain is remembered, rightly remembered, as one of the finest moments in British military history. The courage of the pilots, the spirit of the ground crews, the resilience of the civilian population under bombing, the inspired leadership at the highest levels, all of these deserve their celebration. Churchill's speeches, the radar chain, the Spitfire, these have become icons of national identity, not just in Britain, but across the world wherever people believe in the possibility of standing firm against overwhelming force. And at the center of all that celebration, slightly obscured, slightly sideways, slightly uncomfortable for the official narrative, is the story of Dowding and Park. The men who did the most, who built the system, who made the right calls under the most intense pressure imaginable, who were then dismissed and sidelined and replaced by the men who had argued against them. Their vindication came slowly. It came incompletely. It came, in some ways, too late for them to fully enjoy it. But it came. History has a long memory, longer than institutions and longer than careers and longer than the comfortable narratives that organizations tell about themselves. The historical record is clear. The Dowding system worked. The forward interception strategy worked. The Big Wing, in the context of the Battle of Britain, did not. And the men who understood this, who built it, who flew it, who defended it against political attack, were right. They were right. And that matters. It matters to the history, and I would argue it matters to something larger than history, to the idea that getting things right has value in itself, that the truth of what happened deserves to be known and understood and taught, even when knowing and understanding it means admitting that our institutions failed their best people at their finest hour. The young men who climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes in the summer of 1940, who took off into a sky full of death and fought with everything they had. They deserve the most accurate possible account of the battle they fought. Not a comfortable account. Not a politically convenient account. The true account. With all its complications. With all its arguments. With all its failures alongside its triumphs. The Big Wing controversy is not a footnote. It is not a curiosity for specialists. It is a window into the soul of an institution under pressure, a test case for how we treat the people who do the right thing in the right way at the most critical moment, and a reminder that the politics of military command can be just as consequential as the tactics of military combat. Sometimes more so. So the next time you see a photograph of a Spitfire climbing into a summer sky, that silhouette, those elliptical wings, that sound that everyone who ever heard it said was unlike anything else on Earth. Think about what was really behind it. Think about the radar stations on the coast, and the plotters in the operations rooms, and the controller's voice in the pilot's earpiece. Think about the system. Think about the man who built it. Think about what it cost him. And think about whether we have learned the lesson that his story is trying to teach us. Because if we have not, if we still reward the ambitious political operator over the quiet, stubborn, difficult, brilliant person who simply does the right thing in the right way, then we have not really understood what the Battle of Britain was about. And we have not really earned the right to celebrate it. The few are worth honoring. The system that gave them a fighting chance is worth understanding. And the man who built that system, who sat in his office at Bentley Priory night after night, tracking the plots, managing the resources, refusing to be panicked into throwing everything away in a single dramatic gesture, that man deserves more than a peerage and a belated statue. He deserves to be understood. Hugh Dowding, Keith Park, they were right. Trafford Leigh-Mallory and Douglas Bader, brave men both, skilled men both, were wrong. And the institution that chose the wrong men over the right ones in the autumn of 1940 should be a case study in every staff college, every leadership program, every organization that claims to value competence over politics. That is the story of the Big Wing controversy. That is the argument that changed history. And now it is yours to think about, to argue about, to disagree with if you choose. Because the best history is not history you simply receive, but history you wrestle with. Here, then, is the question I want to leave with you today. If you had been in that Air Ministry meeting room in the autumn of 1940, with both sides laying out their arguments before you, Park and Dowding's meticulous record of tactical success on one hand, Bader and Leigh-Mallory's passionate, charismatic case for the Big Wing on the other, which argument would you have found more convincing? And what does your answer tell you about the difference between what sounds right and what actually is right? Think about that. Argue about it. Because 75 years later, the argument is still alive, and it is still worth having.